Ni hao, you're listening to People in the Know, bringing you insights into the headline news in China and around the world. I'm Chen Guan in Beijing. In this edition of the program, we're taking a look at the latest situation in Libya. Now, from the international scene, we're joined by Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh, Professor of African and Global History, Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University in Canada. Professor Ibhawoh, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Libya's rebel forces have overrun the capital, Tripoli. This was like a very dramatic turn in this battle between Libya's rebel forces and Colonel Gaddafi's army. Before this happens, both sides were like locked in a very fierce battle. What do you think has tipped the balance between Gaddafi's forces and the rebel forces in such a short period of time?
Well, I think there are a number of factors that have changed the scope and the tide of this conflict so dramatically in the past few hours. Of course, there is the support from the NATO forces, but most importantly, I think, is that in the past 2 weeks, the Gaddafi regime has lost a lot of legitimacy as more and more countries begin to recognize the Transitional National Council. There was also the concern that Gaddafi really did not have as much support as many people were led to believe, such that as the opposition forces advanced towards Tripoli, it was easy for those who were sitting on the fence or were scared of the Gaddafi regime to switch side. And so you see the kind of dramatic collapse that seemed to have occurred in the past few hours.
Now there's not much information about the whereabouts of Colonel Gaddafi, but if the rebel forces do manage to catch him, what will happen to Colonel Gaddafi?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of time. We're just hearing now that one of the sons who we thought had been captured has appeared and made his presence known. So there is still conflicting information as to what the situation is on the ground. It is an unfolding development. But I think that the collapse of the regime is inevitable. Gaddafi once controlled the whole country, but now he controls only a section of Tripoli. If Gaddafi is captured alive, which we can't be sure of at this moment, I think what will happen is that the NATO forces, who really have been masterminding much of what is happening on the opposition side, would like to see him brought before some kind of international tribunal. There is a pressure on both the interim, the transition government, and their NATO backers to be seen to be fair, to be seen to be following rules of international warfare, and to be seen as dispensing international justice in this case.
NATO commanders in the first place envisioned a short campaign in which Gaddafi's forces would likely crumble very quickly, but instead the war in Libya still dragged on for almost half a year. What made Gaddafi hold out for far longer than was predicted? How do you assess NATO's role in the process?
I think most experts from the very beginning made it clear that the situation in Libya would be unlike Egypt or Tunisia. For anyone who knows the history of Libya, you will know that unlike these other countries, Libya is a highly factionalized country. It has only known one man, one strong man, and one strong man only in the person of Colonel Gaddafi. And over the years, Gaddafi has built a very strong and loyal support, not only within his country, but also across Africa, where he has a lot of influence. So I think it was clear from the beginning that this was not going to be a walkover. Those who thought that Gaddafi would be run over like Mubarak were mistaken, and it is evident now that this is going to be a hard-won struggle, not an easy one.
This is People in the Know. We're speaking to Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh, Professor of African and Global History, Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University in Canada. How will this turmoil in Libya affect the whole African continent? As we already witnessed political changes in African countries like Egypt, will it bring even more instability to the region?
I see two possibilities what is happening in Libya. In fact, I would argue that the developments in Libya would have a more lasting impact on the continent than what we have seen in either Egypt or Tunisia. And there are two possibilities. The first possibility is that what is happening in Libya may be a lesson to authoritarian regimes across the continent, not just in the continent but also in the Arab world. I'm sure that the leaders in Syria and Yemen are watching very closely developments in Libya. That is on the short term. On the long term, I think that a democratic and a pluralistic Libya will have a more stabilizing influence on the continent. Gaddafi had a lot of influence in the continent. He was involved in many of the conflicts from Chad to Sudan to Niger, and he has been a very central figure in the continent. My thinking is that on the long term, if democracy and stability comes to Libya, Libya stands to play a more constructive role in the politics of the continent than it has played under the regime of Gaddafi.
On the humanitarian aspect, how would you assess the political chaos in Libya from that aspect? After several months of airstrikes and ground fights, are we seeing a humanitarian crisis unfolding? And especially now, worries are growing over the possibility that some of the rebel forces might take vengeance on factions loyal to Gaddafi.
This is a grave concern. We all know the lessons of Iraq, where the fall of Saddam Hussein did not bring about the kind of democracy and stability that a lot of people expected on the short run. And I fear the same unfolding in Libya. Already we've heard reports of revenge attacks and summary executions on the part of the opposition forces. I think there is a real threat that unless the situation is closely monitored, that there may be chaos in the short run, particularly given, as I mentioned before, the fact that Libya is historically a highly factionalized society with lots of tribal and ethnic loyalties. So there is grave concern, and I think it's a serious concern. If you ask me, I will say that is one area that seems to have been overlooked in this quest to get Gaddafi out of power. I don't think the international community has paid enough attention to putting in place the structures to make sure that we do not have a reoccurrence of the tragic events that happened in Iraq in the wake of the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime.
What are needed to be done on the part of the international community? What kind of structure is ideal for settle the problem here?
I think the message has to be made very clear that all parties will be held accountable. And that does not just mean the Gaddafi regime, but also the leaders of the transitional national government who are taking over apparently in the country. I think it has to be made clear that any party that is found to be involved in gross human rights violations will have to face the International Criminal Court. This is not going to be another victor's justice. Justice has to be seen as being fair and as being balanced. And I think that message has to come not just from the International Criminal Court and United Nations, but also from NATO. And NATO has to make it clear to those it's working with on the ground that they will be held responsible for gross human rights violations just as much as agents and elements of the Gaddafi regime will be held accountable.
It now seems to be just a matter of time before the opposition forces can take control of the entire country, and after that, Libya will face a democratic transition. But it seems that there are still a level of rifts amongst the rebels themselves. What will this bring to the transitional period?
This is yet another example why Libya is not Egypt. In Egypt, you had a cohesive and established military that was able to stand on the side of the people and step in effectively after the fall of Mubarak. We do not have that in Libya. What we have really is more of a coalition of convenience.